Hi, this is Hart Hagan with Let's Talk, and I'm joined by Jake Bush, Rolf Friis, and Mary Aguilera. How y'all doing today?
Doing great, Hart.
Doing great. Thanks, Art.
I am holding up somehow.
Right. So what we're talking about today is some tragic violence that has occurred in our hometown of Louisville, Kentucky recently. And I'm going to give a very brief introduction and then open it up to people who have a more extensive grasp on the facts than I do. But Brianna Taylor was shot in her home by police after they erroneously knocked on the wrong door and didn't announce themselves anyway under any circumstances. And then there was a shooting in a protest, several people shot in a protest under circumstances that we will go into. But we fairly uniformly have a little bit of contempt for the authorities and that make this, that set things up like this and make things like this happen. But why don't we start with Rolf? Why don't you start and give us a rundown of the facts of the Brianna Taylor and also the occurrences that happened at the protest a couple of nights ago.
Okay, so Brianna Taylor's a 26-year-old EMT. She has a boyfriend named Kenneth Taylor, and they were the victims of a no-knock raid late at night. I'm not sure what time. I think it was around 2 or 3. And in that, Brianna Taylor was killed. Kenneth Taylor, not knowing what's going on as a gun owner, fired back, injured a police officer, received charges for that, which were later dropped. Come to find out, there was no reason for the police to even be anywhere near her home. The person that they were looking for apparently was already in custody from earlier that day, yet they came to Brianna Taylor's home, didn't knock, and shot the place up. I think it was like 26 gunshots, something like that. Just crazy. So, you know, that led on to the protests. I think Jake probably has more information on the protests, but the protest started a couple nights ago. And the first one, 7 people were shot. The police are denying having been the ones to fire. So we don't really know who it is. There's some theories on that. And hopefully that comes out here in the wash in the next couple of days. But the protests ongoing last night again. Tonight, I know the governor has said he's going to do a curfew as well as call in the National Guard. So, you know, we'll see how it goes down tonight. But Jake, do you have some more information on the actual protest? I think you were there.
Yeah, so I was there last night. That would be the 29th, Friday the 29th. The night before, though, was the first protest. So on the 28th, that was the first protest related to this situation that I know of. And it was pretty, from what I understand, it was pretty spontaneous. Some of the local Black Lives Matter folks got together to protest and have a night of remembrance for Brianna. But then they were surrounded by police, and shortly after that, some shooting started. The police claimed that they were not responsible for the shooting. There were 7 people shot. They claimed that a revolver was used, but they again claimed that they were not responsible, and nobody seems to know who it was. I spoke to people who were physically present at that event, and they say that they don't know who it was. There was nobody captured on video. Nobody was arrested. I did see a journalist today say that they were threatened by somebody with a gun at that, but the local Black Lives Matter organizer helped to pull them away from that person. Which all of this is very strange to me, very fishy to me, that this person was not found or arrested, and we have no recording of them. They were not picked up by police. They were not identified by police. And I was watching videos and live feeds that people were posting to social media, and they were pretty much surrounded by riot police. So I really have no idea how that person was not found. But it seems like they were directing their violence primarily at the protesters.
So this is a lot of information coming at me at once. Why don't we take it from the top and pretend that nobody knows anything? What What happened at Brianna Taylor's house and why?
So the police were serving what they call a no-knock warrant, right? And as Rolf said, they chose the wrong house. It was an erroneous serving of the warrant. They were not at the
Oops, sorry.
right. Yeah. Oops. And a no-knock warrant, for those who don't know, just is exactly as it sounds. It gives police the authority to enter the home without knocking. Normally, the standard procedure is that police have to identify themselves as police, so you don't have a situation like what happened where Kenneth Taylor opened fire because he was not aware that these were police officers that were breaking into the home. And currently, that practice has been suspended here in Louisville. It has not been completely revoked, but the mayor has suspended the use of no-knock warrants. And while that was going on, Brianna was shot by the police.
Okay, what else? Well, what kind of observations do we have? Anybody? What do you observe from this?
To me, it all strikes. So without getting into my experiences at the protest on Friday night, the 29th, it's hard for me to build this case, but why my takeaways from the last few days was that Brianna was killed because the police were negligent, and were not doing anything in a humane or responsible manner, even if they had the justification under the law to enter the home, and they could probably find some way to get out of being tried for killing her. What they did was completely irresponsible and inhumane. And then the protest happened the night of the 28th. And to me, again, and I can get into more of why I believe this theory without sounding like a bit of a conspiracy nut, but it sounds to me that there are infiltrators either from the police or for right-wing groups that are attempting to escalate the violence to such a point that it gives them justification for further repression of the Black citizens of Louisville. And again, if you want me to, I can relay my story from the 29th, because I saw some very, very concerning things, and I had some very concerning discussions with people who stayed all night, even as the rioting or looting or anything escalated. So if you want, I can get into that, because boy, I got some stories.
Yeah, please do.
So I joined the protest last night, the 29th, sometime around 7:30, 7:45 p.m. I was with a group of friends and my wife as well. And we went downtown where we knew the protest had gotten to, where the square is in front of the courthouse by the Department of Justice and everything, or the Hall of Justice. And it was a very, it was a bizarre scene for me. I'm not used to seeing protests that disciplined, especially here in Louisville, where the protests are usually pretty small, but it was well over 1,000 people marching in all different directions. Very well disciplined, very well organized, very on message is how I would put it. And there was, the things that I saw. That. Right, you can't have that. And so the things that I saw that you could maybe construe as disorderly, there was the burning of a flag in front of the Hall of Justice. Somebody pulled it down. They burned it on the sidewalk. They didn't burn anything else. They didn't escalate the fire. There might have been some fireworks go off or banging on a door at the Hall of Justice. I couldn't see it because it ended almost immediately. We heard some bangs, like somebody was banging on a door, and then it ended before I could see anymore. Maybe 30, 45 minutes later, I'm walking around the south side of the Hall of Justice, and people come running the other direction and saying, the riot police are here, the riot police are here, you need to get out of here. And so we wait just a minute, and we look, and we see maybe 2 or 3 dozen riot police, some state police, some LMPD, some Department of Corrections, full gear, full suits of armor even, with the 3-foot wooden batons, marching in formation. And people, of course, rush to form a human chain sort of against that. And then I go around the northeast side of the square, and I see the same thing, coming from the northeast. So it seemed to me in that moment that this is a pincer movement, that they are attempting to come from two different directions.
When I hear pincer movement, I think battlefield stuff.
Yeah, it very much had the feel of a military action. That's very much how I felt in the moment. Was this is the moment where we either get to the front or we leave. And my wife and a few other people I was with said, I physically don't think that I can stand up to the aggression, the tear gas, and all that. So I need to leave. And so of course I'm thinking, hey, I got a responsibility to the people around me. Let's get out of here. So we find a way out. We cut through another street that wasn't blocked. And we get maybe 2 blocks before we see smoke rising from behind us. We start hearing the bangs loud. I grew up on a farm. I've been around firearms and loud noises my whole life. And it was loud. It was not just somebody banging on a drum or something. It was something going off. And so we get out just as that is happening. And I get word from some people who were there at the front, people who were at medic tables, who were purely there to stand in the back and help people who had been tear gassed or scraped up or beaten or something. And they said they were completely surrounded by riot police and cut off from the other protesters. And then the protesters were scattered. There were not mass arrests. There was no effort to clear the streets. There were no demands made. No, you need to leave now or else. It was just immediate tear gassing and scattering. And then the police would break off into lines blocking off streets. So they basically sent
If they had
people
made a
moving.
demand, it seems to me, if they had made a verbal demand, it would be apparent how ridiculous that demand was. That what you're doing is dangerous. Anything like that would have seemed ridiculous on its face. And it would have been
Yes.
filmed.
Yes, because Attica Scott, our representative, was there and was hit with tear gas herself. And she said that where I was, there was no demand made because, as you said, Hart, it would have been an absurd demand because there was nothing to demand. People were blocking streets and climbing up the fire escapes in some case, but they just stood there. They just chanted and they held their signs and they held space. They held space to prove that this is the people's space, and they were not doing anything more than that. And then once people got scattered and cut off from leadership, which again, I cannot praise enough, the organizers from Black Lives Matter and the many other groups here in Louisville did an unbelievable job managing this mass of people who were very angry, very tense, but they remained on message as long as they were together. As soon as the police scattered them, that is when you saw the buildings being burned, the trash cans being burned, the glass being shattered. None of that started until people were scattered and attacked by police first. And it is worth noting that the first place that I saw burned was a subway downtown. God forbid we burn the subway, first of all. My condolences to the great subway. But that was the first one, and the video that I saw was a lone man, a white man, whatever that's worth, going up and breaking the window, and a number of other protesters trying to stop him and saying, hey, the protest is back on 5th Street. What are you doing? Get back over there, get back over there. But we're not here for this specifically. We're here to go back to the protest. And he refused to do that and instead set to burning the subway. And this is the beginning of my suspicion that this looting and burning and property damage was perhaps instigated by people who were not protesters themselves. And I don't want to do the old trope of saying, well, these are all outside agitators, because that's not right either. But it is worth noting that the police were very accepting of the property damage. They made no attempt to stop any of it. In many cases, they stood directly in front of it and watched it happen with no effort whatsoever to disperse the people.
That's very significant. If they were there to use force, police have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. If they were there to use force, here's your opportunity. If you want to use force to prevent property damage, here's your chance. And you're saying they didn't lift a hand to prevent actual property damage.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing. You know, I have a colleague in DSA who I won't name for obvious reasons, who said he was not participating in the property damage, but he was amongst the people who were. When they got scattered, he ended up in that group in the chaos. And as he was watching them do this, and he looked over and saw the police were not moving in on that group on 4th Street, I believe is where it was. But instead, he turned and saw that the police had built a line in the road to prevent people from going back west, and not moving in to stop the violence, or well, that wasn't really violence, it was property damage, but they made no attempt to stop the property damage whatsoever, which suggests to me that that was deemed either acceptable or even good for what the police were trying to accomplish, which I think is the character assassination of a movement in the name of Brianna Taylor, and all the other victims of police violence here in Louisville.
Let me validate that. From the perspective of a Martin Luther King, is he nonviolent in his heart? Probably, but nonviolence was pragmatic. And because as soon as you become violent, it gives legitimacy to the forces that want to use violence against you, to the forces that want to use the authority of the state to break everything up and send everybody home and arrest people. But when violence occurs, then it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good to your movement if violence is associated with your movement. So what's to stop the police force, or even, the prison industrial complex, from hiring thugs? Some of them might be trained in the military, trained in police, and to create disruption and distraction and property damage so as to legitimize the use of force and to delegitimize the otherwise legitimate, peaceful movement.
This is a strategy we've seen from the police across the country for the last several years at these protests, and that is just to stand down and watch. If not go further than that, but at least stand down and watch. So what that does is it enables the media to frame these protests as looting or riots, or just paint them negatively, and then that way that the protesters, what they're actually protesting for, can't be taken seriously. This also gives the police the opportunity to take violence against the protesters if there's something, some kind of damage going on or some kind of violence occurring. So we see these types of things. I saw a stat where they're saying that about 1 in every 6 protesters at these large protests are generally undercover police or undercover FBI. They're there to instigate, to cause trouble. And we just saw a case of that happen in Minneapolis with the St. Paul cop that was caught smashing out the AutoZone there on camera. And that was blamed on the protesters, and they're saying they're destroying their own neighborhood, their own businesses. But it never was them. It was this officer from the neighboring city doing this. So we see these things. It's hard to tell them apart, but that's what it's used for, is that narrative, and that also allows them to use more of the military tactics against the protesters.
So when you have when you decide to bring in the National Guard, when you think you have the legitimacy, when you think the situation calls for bringing in the National Guard, that provides money. In the long run, it provides money for national defense, so-called national defense. It provides money for police forces. It provides money for to send our police to Israel to learn how to do what they've been doing to Palestinians and other Arabs for time immemorial. Whatever it is they know how to do, our police forces get sent over there to. So Jake, you're nodding. Tell me, what is it we're talking about here?
So what we're talking about here is sort of an international collaboration of police and military in the service of a maintenance of the status quo and the maintenance of our power hierarchies. You know, I think it's telling, it's almost hack at this point because it's something everybody says and it makes them feel clever on Twitter or Facebook. Well, when the white people show up and shut down the state capitol with assault rifles, they don't get arrested. And, you know, that's right, because those protests are not changing the power hierarchy in any way. What people were protesting here in Louisville and will continue to protest here in Louisville is threatening the current hierarchy of power. And I'm sorry, I wanted to ask real quick because Mary, if I'm not mistaken, you're not from Louisville specifically, and I could be wrong, but I'm curious to hear what the narrative is, because to me the narrative is clear and it's one I just said. But what are you hearing outside of Louisville, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah, I'm hearing different narratives. I'm connected with leaders across the country with the Poor People's Campaign. So I'm seeing lots of different narratives. Some are the same as what's going on in Louisville. Here in Cincinnati, we have some history. So there's these kind of dynamics that make a little bit different and a little bit more controlled by actually our citizens, I would say, because there's actually an agreement. It's one of a kind of people, citizens with the police authority, and that came from the riots back in 2000. So it's a little different here in Cincinnati. I'm hearing up in Columbus that it was very similar to what happened in Louisville. Congressman, Columbus City Council person they were both maced. I've heard from friends that they were there and it was a completely peaceful protest, and they did the exact same thing. They came in and they just, basically, no, you're not, we're in control. One thing I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on, thinking back when we did our 40 days of action with the Poor People's Campaign. They did not arrest us. People shut down the financial district in Boston for hours and hours. We were in the state capitals and across the country. They refused to arrest us. So just like they can go in and use force at will, they can also use that restraint at will. And, I think it's really interesting to see both sides of that coin, because it was a deliberate tactic across the country, that they were not, because they didn't want to give us the power. They didn't want to give us, it took us four times trying to, get some attention, and finally we had to shut down a road, and that did it up in Columbus. But I just find it really interesting.
So you're saying they have a trial. Let me tell our listeners who we are, what we are, where we are. This is Hart Hagan with Let's Talk, and I'm joined by Louisvillians Jake Bush and Rolf Friis and Cincinnati resident Mary Aguilera. We're talking about the recent violence that has occurred in Louisville, and I'm here to say, don't believe anything you've heard on the mainstream media. We are a non-commercial radio station. We have no ties to any sponsors that are corporate in nature, so we can say what the heck we want. And so Mary was talking about how they have a choice, they have a choice as to whether they use force or not. And so what do we have to say about that?
I think that you always have to ask what are the police trying to accomplish here? That is the question I kept asking as I was seeing things unfold. I was watching WDRB's coverage, and I was a local news channel. I was watching a local news channel, and I was flabbergasted because the only focus they had was on the property damage. They would occasionally go over to the group in the Highlands. As I mentioned, people were split off into separate groups with most of the organizers trying to rally people, and they demonstrated very successfully in a very disciplined, on message, on brand way down the Highlands. But the people who were cut off and were still in the chaos and still being cornered by police began doing property damage. And it seemed to me, as I was watching this and I was watching the people I knew who were on the ground, the message I was getting was that the police were very, very okay with showing restraint the moment property damage began. They had no restraint whatsoever during the peaceful, disciplined part of the protest when everybody was together and on message. But as soon as the leaders were cut off from everyone else and discipline broke and the
I
chaos
thought we
started.
had free speech in this country.
Right, yeah, you'd think. But the moment that they see that being used in a disciplined way, that is what they see as the threat. And when they see the property damage, I have to wonder if they saw that as beneficial for them in a PR sense. And I think that's the story. Is that
So you're saying they were not threatened by property damage. They were threatened by peaceful, organized, on message, on brand protesters.
You know, so here's my thing. I don't want to do this thing where I try to speak ill of the people who were doing property damage or were looting, because honestly, to me, that's not the story. I think that they saw it as a PR boon, and I'll leave it at that. To see the looting, I thought they thought this was good PR for the police, and I'll just leave it at that. Personally, the story to me is that all of this started because of the aggression of the police when people were disciplined. And it was not until they began to show aggression and violence that people started to take more escalating tactics. It all began with the police. That's the story to me.
So you're saying that the police were actually the aggressive ones here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The escalations were all very controlled when people did, like I said, somebody burned a flag, somebody might have banged on a building or set off some fireworks. All of that ended very quickly, and I can't speak more on it because I didn't personally witness it. But it seemed to me that things were very controlled, disciplined, on message, moving as one, until the police made a very concerted effort to stop people from moving as one.
So this was last night, right?
Yes, this was on the 29th.
And it was the night before that there was a shooting at the protest. So we're talking about the police being aggressive when there's peaceful protests. Then you're saying the police get aggressive. Then there's property damage. And this is not even the same night as that there was a shooting that occurred under mysterious circumstances. You know, when I heard about that, it was hard for me to imagine who is the person with the gun. What are they, who is the person with the gun? What are they trying to accomplish? Are the people who are protesting? I mean, all it takes is one bad apple on either side, I suppose. But as a systemic matter, is this peaceful protest going to engender people coming to the protest with a gun and shooting up others, especially when nobody knows who that person was, and it had to have been a professional that knew how to draw a gun, use it quickly, put it back, and get out of the way and avoid detection.
And I don't want to take up too much space. I'll let Rolf and Mary talk, but we can bookmark that and move on to my theory for today, the 30th, if we get a chance to. But go ahead.
So we can Jake, you can either go further into that, or Rolf and Mary can talk. Mary?
Yeah, y'all have something to say, go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously I wasn't at the protest the last 2 nights, but I do follow protests in general, and I watch a lot of live streams of pretty much all the protests over the last decade. And it's definitely a pattern. So even though I wasn't there, I can pretty much know that all these things go the same, and that people are showing up to protest. They're not showing up to cause violence or to damage property. I mean, you never know. You get a few thousand people, there might be some people that just are bored and need something to do, but generally people are there for a purpose, for a cause.
Yeah, I'm bored,
Time
so
and
I
time
think I'm
again.
going to go shoot somebody at a protest. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So time and time again, I see it where it is the police that are starting the stuff. It generally happens, you know, as the sun goes down, and then they end up kettling people into an area, and that's when the tear gas comes out. And it's like, you know, it's like a clock. You can predict it's going to happen at pretty much every large protest. So that's just, you have to be aware of these things. You know, they're going to try to frame this protest. You know, there's going to be people there who are going to pretend to be part of the protest, but what they're really there to do is to make the protest look bad, or, you know, lead to some destruction, whatever it is. So it is a pattern. And yeah, again, I totally agree with Jake on his theory. I think more than likely is something like that. And,
Yeah, well, y'all know Max Blumenthal, right?
yes.
So there's this video that showed up on Twitter. He's in D.C. and he's just walking along, and he's a reporter, and he's been to Latin America and the Middle East. So now he's in D.C. He's walking down the street, and here's a guy who he can spot as a plainclothes police officer a mile off, and he got out of this SUV that was a unmarked police car that you can spot from a mile off. So he confronts the guy that gets out of the car, and this guy can't answer any reasonable question about what he is or why he's there, what he's doing. Then there's two other guys in this car, apparently it's the getaway vehicle, and he's asking them all sorts of reasonable questions about what they're doing and why. He said, "Are y'all police officers? You don't look like police officers." And so it sounds like, here's somebody undercover going in to cause trouble at a protest. And one person asked, why would they do that? And another person asked, why the hell would they not do that? It's somebody's job to create tension and violence where there was none, so as to legitimize all the police force.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, you know, this is a good segue to what I wanted to bookmark, which is that there has been some photos coming out today, it's the 30th, where, you know, with the National Guard being called in, I think Bashir called in 300 or so National Guard members to supplement the police here in Louisville, which is already being supplemented by, you know, all of the Kentucky State.
I'm going to let you continue in just a minute, but Bashir can't protect the Bullitt County people from a toxic radioactive pipeline, which he could do with the stroke of a pen and the nod of a head. He will not cause the Department of Water or the Energy and Environmental Cabinet to go in and prevent actual violence in the form of toxic waste and radioactivity and climate disruption. He can't be bothered to do that, but just with a nod of a head and a stroke of a pen, he can call in 300 National Guard that are not needed. And I'm thinking, oh, we're going to bring in police. We're going to bring in some over-policing to solve a problem that was caused by over-policing. Don't get me started. I'm sorry, Jake. You were saying.
No, it's a great supplement because it sort of points to the priority here. But, you know, with the curfew being set for 9 p.m. tonight, which protests are planning to go on tonight until 9 p.m. But with that happening, with the National Guard coming in, there has been photos come out recently of armed white men in Hawaiian shirts posing as protesters to escalate. And I know that they're there to escalate because, and again, if you think I sound nuts, you're welcome to get me on Twitter. You're welcome to look it up for yourself. But there is a mountain of evidence that shows that white supremacist groups online have been joking about starting a second civil war, a race war. They've been making these jokes and baiting each other on.
Let's look at that for just a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, the question is not whether you're dealing with otherwise intelligent people. I mean, you're dealing with people who have their own narrative about what's going on here, and they are being played by the people that have the money, that want to make money from over policing.
Absolutely.
To me, it's not a theory, it's a certainty. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are there with the express intent of escalating violence. And it's worth noting that because again, I don't like getting into the whole, are these from protesters from out of town? Are they infiltrators? Are they this? Are they that? I like to keep it simple and just say that if the police had done the right thing.
Well, keeping it simple includes and involves following the money. Keeping it simple means looking at prior activities and seeing what has been done before. Keeping it simple means let's give the protesters some credit and not blame everything on peaceful protesters. Keeping it simple means looking at police forces that have a history of violence and they literally get away with murder and they want to keep doing it.
Absolutely. And they have their fellow travelers with their now Hawaiian shirts. So.
Yeah, I'd also like, kind of take the other side as, not other side as an opposite viewpoint, but there is so much boldness now, on the other hand, that they don't even care if someone is filming them. That the girl who filmed the death, they didn't care. They did not care that, and that's why they're arresting NBC reporters, and like they don't care anymore.
So Mary, you're talking about somebody filming a death. Are you talking about in Minneapolis or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, Minneapolis. The young girl in they're arresting these reporters. Like,
What was the gentleman's name? He was choked to death for selling loose cigarettes.
Eric Garner.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, Mary. Keep going.
And so there's also that boldness of they don't care anymore. So there's two extremes, I think, or not.
Well, what would you expect, Mary? Why would you expect them to care? I mean, fill me in. You're saying they don't care anymore. What do you mean by that?
As far as even if someone's watching and filming them, they're so empowered to just do whatever they want because they know nothing.
Oh, yeah.
Has been done.
So you're saying that in any under normal circumstances, a criminal would worry about being caught.
Correct.
But under these circumstances, they're criminals who know that they're not going to be held accountable.
Yes. Thank you for deciphering that.
That's what you mean when you say they're bold because they know that there's no accountability for this.
No accountability.
How many, two questions. One is how many unarmed people of color or people of any color, how many unarmed people have been killed and how many of those officers were even fired, let alone charged with or convicted of a crime.
Yes, exactly.
And if they were convicted of a crime, they'd just get a job with a private security force somewhere, but they don't even have to deal with that.
Or another town, or another city, or another state. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You got to remember, they're just doing their jobs literally. The police exist to protect the establishment and the system from the people. So they're not there to protect and serve for us. They're literally there to protect from us. So
Rolf, that sounds
exactly
like
what they're paid to do.
That sounds like something I would say. Tell me more. Their job is to protect the system from the people. Protect the system and the property owners from the people. Tell me more.
That's pretty much it. That's why they're hired. I mean, there's only so much they can do in a day. So yeah, they might drive around and get some other stuff done. But really, they're just there for protection to keep the system going as is and to quell any dissent. that takes place in the community. As a side note, when they're not doing that, you know, they're there to generate income through like speeding tickets and stuff like that, seatbelt laws and that kind of thing.
Civil asset forfeiture.
Cash
Exactly.
bail.
Exactly. Just because somebody's getting arrested, why do they have to have their stuff taken? You know, there's no reason for that. That shouldn't be legal. So that's a good point there.
Well,
But that's
certain
what we need to do,
elements,
and that's something they
certain,
taught us.
that's a big source of income for
It is.
the police. I mean, some people don't even need a salary. They just, who knows what the CIA is like a tenth of the Pentagon budget that we know of. And they make all kinds of money running drugs and guns and et cetera. And that's at the federal level and at the international level, but it's the same thing. I mean, was it RICO gives I don't know if RICO is still a thing, I'm sure it is, but RICO was like, okay, if you're involved if you get apprehended for any involvement in a drug situation, then then the powers that be, the police, can seize your assets even before you've been found guilty of a crime. They can take your assets and you're out of luck.
Yeah, and it's good that we get this discussion going of the sort of political economy of what the police are for and what they do in a literal sense. Because
that is I'm going to let you continue, but that is so good. The political economy of what the police do. That is so good. Talk to me.
Yeah, so, I'm going to say this with the disclaimer that I do not represent Hart, Rolf, or Mary when I say what I'm about to say.
We don't represent, nobody represents anybody. We all say whatever we want. Go ahead.
Great, awesome. But, I consider myself an amateur Marxist because I don't want to say that I'm a Marxist because I'm not an academic in the literal sense.
Subversive. That's subversive. You're
Indeed.
subversive.
The FBI is kicking down my door as we speak. Luckily, I have my ferocious French bulldog who's going to protect me. But
one of these days we need to talk about Fred Hampton. But go ahead.
We do. We absolutely do, because he pointed out, as Rolf also just said, that it is the job of the police in a capitalist society to protect that system, right? And what does that mean in a literal sense, in a day-to-day sense? That means the protection, above all else, of the means of production. Now, what does that mean? Now, that means that they are there to protect the material, in many cases, the inanimate objects that are used by people to produce more profit, right?
All this left analysis is going to make some people's heads break. I mean, there's too much analysis. We've been invited and even required to oversimplify everything our entire lives. And you're analyzing something here. God.
Yes, it's something that actually, you say that David Harvey, one of the great academics, and a good reason why I don't claim to be a Marxist, because that man can claim to be, because he's brilliant and spends the time on it.
Yeah, he's card carrying. He's got the creds.
Yeah, he's brilliant, and he broke it down very eloquently once by saying that this analysis that we do that seems so heavy-handed and so hard to penetrate, he said, when you really, really get to the root of it, it's quite simple, and it's something that children understand very well. It's just that there's a deliberate effort to not think like that.
Right. If you can't explain it in terms that a third grader could understand, somebody's getting hosed,
Yes.
A law professor of mine used to say, if anytime you hear Latin, somebody's going to get screwed, so you have these special terminology that not everybody can understand, and the purpose of that is to conceal what's really going on, and that's what the free market economy is. You can't really explain it once you do explain it, it's obvious that it's a fraud. But I digress. Go ahead. Mary, did you want to say something? Okay, go ahead, Jay.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I tried to unmute. Yeah, so as you were saying that, I was saying it really is very simple. It's not, it's connecting the dots, and they just have never allowed us to connect the dots. And it's very intentional. I have this theory around with Martin Luther King about the beloved community. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with that term, beloved community. I just learned about it, and I'm 50 something years old, and I think that's intentional. That they don't want us to know this history. They want to keep them dreaming. They want them. That's why the dream was the narrative, because a beloved community would mean that dream would be fulfilled, and God forbid, people would come together and have power and learn each other's differences and appreciate each other's differences. But no, instead they put the dream out there for the white folk, to keep that narrative going. So for me, it's all connected to all these other issues.
Sounds great, but fill me in. Beloved, what does beloved community mean? What is the narrative about the dream?
Yes, so the beloved community is this idea that we all come together and appreciate each other's differences, but from a foundation of love and unity, and that those kind of altruistic values.
Mm-hmm.
And we use those values to, when there is conflict, to have resolution. But there's a deep respect for each other's differences. And that beloved community term, if you go to the King Center's website, you'll see it explained. And that really was where all this, the work that Martin Luther King did, that's where that came from. And the dream of, I have a dream that, all these things, beautiful things would happen. And that's the narrative from that speech that we've pushed and made famous and made, that's the narrative to keep them dreaming, to think that they could never achieve it. For me, that's what that is about. But if the narrative had been, oh, let's build a beloved community. Oh, no, that's too scary. We're not going to allow, because that would mean we wouldn't need police. That would mean
Right.
that we'd all get along and we respect each other. So it's all connected.
Well, there's so much. See, so how would somebody respond if you said that? And their response is typically, oh, you're being idealistic. That's not the way the world really is. We have to be realistic. There's a lot of pushback whenever you say something that it's almost, oh, that is just categorically unachievable, and let's go watch a violent Hollywood movie. And that kind of thing. So, but idealism is beat back ferociously, or at least you're ridiculed and you're jeered for having, if you want to see unrealistic, then spending $1.25 trillion a year on military is unrealistic. But that's said to be realistic. Meanwhile, having a healthcare system that is cheaper than what we have now, where everybody is covered, that's unrealistic. But it's somehow realistic to spend 18% of our GDP on healthcare. And so anyway, this thing about being realistic and pragmatic is the narrative that you have to meet with when you say something that, I mean, the beloved community sounds pretty damn practical to me, to not over police neighborhoods and to resolve as much conflict as we can with some kind of conflict resolution or just common sense. Anyway.
And I think that the parts of the protest that I was talking about before the police arrived with the tear gas, I think it's a testament to that. Because what we saw was indeed orderly conduct. People were there with an order and a responsibility to one another, and with discipline that was not directed by the police. And that is a demonstration of what you're talking about, is that if it is very possible to have a different way of ordering things and a different way of disciplining one another that does not rely on people with guns and badges. It is 100% possible. And there's a lot of literature on that. There are examples in real life of that. There are a lot of scholars on prison abolition and police abolition And it's true that these things can be done. And if I could go back to my brief sort of analysis, it's just that the economic system we have necessitates the use of force by police. That it is really that economic system, that unequal, unequitable system, that necessitates that people are forced into line by police.
It seems to mimic the hierarchical type of, everything, everywhere you look, there are hierarchies. Even when they tell us we have freedom, but we go to work for a hierarchical organization where if you're not at the very top, then it's their way or the highway.
Absolutely.
We have
Absolutely.
about 5 or 6 minutes left. What else do we want to talk about? Do we want to let's recount the facts, because you could never get too far from the facts, and besides, somebody might be joining us late. So what happened, and why is it outrageous to you? And Rolf?
With the Brianna Taylor incident,
Sure.
everything about it's outrageous to me. So what happened? We had a no-knock raid at Brianna Taylor's apartment after midnight, somewhere around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, where they just started firing bullets into her place of residence. She was killed. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Taylor, lived there. There's a 911 call that's been released where he calls in. He says his girlfriend's been shot. He doesn't know by who. So he's not even aware of who is shooting into his home. It turns out he owns a gun. He fires back. He hits an officer. The officer's okay. But he's then charged, with, I forget the exact charge, but assault on an officer.
Attempted
I'm not
murder.
sure. Attempted murder. Thanks. And that has been dropped, thankfully, due to community feedback mostly. This kicked off protests downtown, started 2 nights ago. 7 people were shot. We don't know exactly by whom. The protests have continued last night and will probably continue tonight. And that's kind of where we are right now, in a nutshell.
And to me, the narrative begins and ends. If you want to debate about whether it's right or wrong to loot or do property damage, begins and ends for me with the police having an incentive to use violent force on people who are disciplined, organized, and peaceful. That is where it all began on the 29th. Was the violence began when the police cornered everyone and tear gassed the entire block.
So Jake, you're saying that on the 29th, the protesters were disciplined, organized, and peaceful, and everything was okay until the policemen used what you call the pincher movement to corner people and tear gas them. And then it was only after that that the property damage started.
That is correct. People were forced apart, leaders were split off from the group, and people were scattered throughout the city and directed their anger from there at the downtown area, which I should note is a place that has for years in Louisville been considered an affront to the citizens of Louisville because it is for and by outside the city developers. And that was where most things went off because the police forced them in that direction away from their leaders.
Start from when you showed up on Friday night. What happened?
So Friday night, I arrived somewhere.
3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, so around 7:45 we arrived, and it was very organized. There was lots of marching in all different directions. There was no central leadership. There was just an understanding, a community understanding of what we were doing. People were keeping each other in line and in check until we saw the riot police come from the southwest, and then people began to form a line to protect one another. I ran around to the northeast and saw the same thing happening. I managed to get out with my family and friends and immediately started seeing smoke and what seemed to be flash grenades. I couldn't tell you for sure, but it was very loud, very, very dangerous there. And people from the front lines asserted that there were no demands made. There was no demand to disperse, just immediate flash grenades and tear gas. And from there, people were scattered throughout the city. and cornered in different parts by the police.
So you're saying, like, I should know this, but you know, 4th Street Live is 4th Street, and you're saying they're coming from the police in a line are coming from the northeast and the northwest and forcing people into 4th Street Live?
It seemed to me, because we were around 5th, 6th, 7th Street, that area, that people were forced out of that area and then began moving to the northeast and the southeast. And the people in the northeast and southeast were kept separate from one another. It was blocked off by the police. And then there was some group that made their way over to 4th Street, and then there was a line of police blocking them from leaving.
So why do you think they had a need to do this?
Because the media were there. They wanted the PR to show, look at these people rioting and looting, and look at this chaos and this horrible scene, you know, which was absolutely not the scene. And it seemed that they had had enough of the peaceful stuff and wanted to get the media to see the quote unquote, you know, dangerous, chaotic, anarchic people, you know, which they were not getting.
You know, the peacefulness of the protest and the thuggishness of the police seems to be so contrary to most people's perception. How does that happen?
Because those are the people that the system depends upon, and there's a concerted effort by media and by our elites to assert the legitimacy of the police as the only people who should or could keep order or keep people safe, quote unquote. But in my experience the other night, it was the exact opposite, that the community had disciplined and coordinated themselves, and it was the police who came from the outside to introduce violence and chaos to the proceedings.
So you're saying that the police, who are supposed to be the keepers of law and order and the preventers of chaos, were actually causing the chaos and preventing a peaceful, orderly protest from occurring.
That is correct, and that has been my experience to some lesser degree in previous demonstrations I've attended, but it was very much on display the other night because the organizers were quite good at organizing, and the police were there to be the official arm of the law, but they were the ones who were introducing the bare face of what happens when you have to protect the hierarchy. They saw it threatened by an organized people, and they attempted to disperse it.
A couple minutes left. Any thoughts that you may have, Mary?
Let's see. I think it'll be interesting to see where we go from here. I'm hoping there can be some kind of unity that's you know, connects us across the country so that we can react to this in a way that's appropriate and doesn't allow these narratives to, you know, I hope we can challenge some of these narratives and really show what's going on, you know, so that people can really see the truth, basically.
Right. Sounds great. Rolf?
I just want to say, you know, with the pattern that's happened the last couple of weeks with Brianna Taylor, with Ahmaud Arbery, with the one in Minneapolis whose name is escaping me right now, we see this pattern going on. It's got society really worked up. I'm hoping we can use this energy level to make some changes in our policing system and in our incarceration system. I don't know if that's going to happen, but this is an opportunity. The passion is there. The people are getting involved all across the country. So hopefully something good can come out of this, you know, out of these bad events.
That sounds great. We have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Hart.
Okay. Hang on for just a minute, but we're going to end the show. Thanks, everybody.